She stood at my door and whispered, "My husband thinks I'm at the market." I should have told her to leave, but instead, I said, "Then stay here longer." It was late in the afternoon when I heard the knock. Soft, almost hesitant, not the kind of knock a delivery man makes, or even a friend who's certain they'll be welcomed. I opened the door and there she was, my neighbor. She stood in the hallway, framed by the golden wash of fading sunlight, a paper bag dangling from one hand as though to keep up the illusion of her errand. She was dressed casually, a simple blouse tucked into a flowing skirt, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made even the ordinary look graceful. Her perfume drifted toward me, subtle and warm, like jasmine mixed with the scent of the outdoors. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but her eyes told a different story, restless, searching, carrying something she wasn't quite ready to name. Before I could even ask, she leaned a little closer, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "My husband thinks I'm at the market." For a heartbeat, I didn't know how to answer. The words hung between us, light as air yet weighted with implication. She wasn't just telling me where she was supposed to be, she was admitting she had chosen to be somewhere else. With me. I stepped aside instinctively, letting the door swing open wider. She moved past me, her presence shifting the atmosphere of my apartment instantly. The faint clatter of her shoes as she slipped them off, the rustle of her skirt brushing against her legs, the soft exhale of breath when she finally sat down on my couch, every detail seemed amplified, like my senses had been turned up a notch. I watched her glance around the room, taking in the scattered books, the mug half forgotten on the coffee table. She looked comfortable in the mess, as though she belonged here more than anywhere else. And maybe that was the part that unsettled me most, how natural it felt to have her in my space. She set the paper bag aside, folding her hands in her lap. When she looked up at me, her gaze held that same quiet mischief she'd had at the door, tempered now by something gentler, maybe relief, maybe longing. I wasn't sure yet. I finally found my voice, a crooked smile tugging at my mouth. "Then stay here longer." The moment stretched, thick with something unspoken, and in her silence I felt the weight of possibilities I wasn't ready to name. She slipped into my apartment as though she'd crossed a threshold into another world. The paper bag she had carried for appearance's sake now rested on the side table, forgotten. I offered her a seat on the couch, but she didn't take it right away. Instead, she wandered slowly, her eyes moving over the little details of my space as though she were memorizing them. The books piled against the wall, the half-open window letting in the late breeze, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. "Still the same mess," she teased, her voice light, though her eyes glimmered with something softer than mockery. I laughed it off, scratching the back of my neck, suddenly aware of every stray item I hadn't bothered to put away. When she finally sat down, it was with a kind of ease that startled me. She tucked her legs neatly to the side, smoothing her skirt as if she were settling into a familiar place. I asked if she wanted tea, and she nodded, her smile lingering. In the kitchen, I caught myself moving slower than usual, listening to the faint rustle of her shifting on the couch, the way she hummed absent-mindedly to herself. By the time I returned with 2 cups, steam rising gently, the air between us felt warmer, more alive. She accepted the cup with both hands, and in that small exchange, her fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, accidental, fleeting. And yet the moment burned quietly in my skin long after. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes holding mine longer than necessary before she took a careful sip. The clink of the spoon against porcelain filled the pause, a sound that felt louder than the street noise outside, louder even than my own heartbeat. We talked, at first about ordinary things, the weather, the neighbors, the trivial errands that made up a day. But soon, her laughter slipped into the room like sunlight through a crack, bright and disarming. Every time she laughed, she leaned just slightly toward me, her hand resting on the couch cushion closer than before. It was such a simple scene, 2 people sitting together with cups of tea, talking in an ordinary apartment. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was anything but ordinary. The way her eyes softened when she listened, the warmth of her presence spilling into the quiet corners of the room, it was as though she'd brought with her not just herself, but a whole different rhythm of life. And as I sat there, laughing with her over nothing at all, I realized I didn't want her to leave any time soon. Our laughter eventually faded, tapering into a silence that was neither awkward nor empty. It was the kind of silence that asked to be filled with something more. She turned the cup in her hands slowly, as if tracing invisible patterns along the porcelain, her eyes fixed on the rising steam. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a softness that felt different from before. "Sometimes," she began, "I feel like no one really sees me anymore." The words came out quietly, but they seemed to linger in the air, heavy with meaning. I watched the way her shoulders dropped as though releasing a weight she carried all too often. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch, giving her room to say more if she wanted to. And she did. "My husband," she paused, searching for the right words. "He's not unkind. He's just distracted. Everything in our life has become routine. The same meals, the same conversations, the same silence. I walk into a room, and it's as if I'm part of the furniture now." Her laugh was bitter, but faint. It wasn't the bright laugh from earlier, it was something that carried a sharp edge of loneliness. She lifted her eyes to mine, almost cautiously, as though afraid of what she'd find there. I held her gaze. I didn't look away, didn't pretend to understand completely, but I let her see that I was listening, really listening. And that seemed to matter more than any answer I could have given. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said after a moment, shaking her head lightly, her hair brushing against her cheek. "Maybe because, you notice things. You've always noticed." Her words caught me off guard, stirring something deep in my chest. I wanted to tell her that yes, I noticed the way her smile always carried a touch of mystery, the way her presence could shift a room without her even trying. But instead, I only said, "You deserve to be seen. By more than just me." Her lips parted slightly at that, her breath catching. For a long moment, she just looked at me, really looked, as though weighing the truth in my words against the silence she carried back home. Her hand, resting loosely on her lap, curled slightly, as though resisting the urge to reach for something. Or maybe someone. And in that moment, I realized the air between us was no longer casual. It was charged, fragile, intimate, and alive. The quiet after her confession stretched between us, thick with things neither of us dared to voice. She placed her half-empty cup on the table, her fingers lingering on the handle a second too long before she finally let go. Then, almost without thinking, she shifted closer on the couch. It was a small movement, barely the width of a cushion, but I felt it immediately. The warmth of her body seemed to radiate into the narrow space between us, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, heavier, more alive. She glanced at my bookshelves, shaking her head with a smile. "You still haven't organized those? I thought you promised yourself last summer." I chuckled nervously, grateful for the excuse to breathe again. "I like to think of it as creative chaos." She laughed, but when the sound faded, it left behind a silence that pulsed differently now. Not uncomfortable, just charged. I became acutely aware of everything, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume, the brush of her skirt against the couch fabric as she shifted slightly toward me again. At one point, she leaned over to pull a book from the shelf nearest the couch. The motion brought her closer still, her shoulder grazing mine in a casual gesture that didn't feel casual at all. The brief contact sent a spark up my arm, quick and startling, but also grounding, as if reminding me that she was real, here, within reach. When she opened the book, her knee brushed lightly against mine. Neither of us moved away. The contact was innocent enough, but it lingered, humming with a quiet electricity. I swallowed hard, focusing on the words she pretended to read aloud, though her voice carried a softness that made it impossible to pay attention. Her laughter returned when she teased the outdated title, but this time, it wasn't free of tension. There was a nervous edge to it, a laugh that filled the air only to mask what hung beneath. I caught myself staring at her, at the curve of her smile, the way a strand of hair slipped loose near her temple. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. Her eyes flicked up to mine, holding for a beat too long. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The air between us said enough. It spoke of temptation, of restraint, of the terrifying sweetness of being so close to someone you weren't supposed to want. And as her knee pressed lightly against mine, I realized I didn't want to pull away. Not yet. The distance between us had become an illusion. Her presence filled the space so completely that I could feel her without even looking, the warmth of her arm near mine, the faint shift of her breath in the quiet room. She closed the book she had been pretending to read and set it down, her fingers lingering on the cover as though stalling for time. Then, slowly, she turned toward me. Her eyes searched mine with a quiet intensity, the kind that left no room for small talk or laughter. "You've got," she began, her voice gentle, almost teasing, a strand of hair out of place. Before I could respond, her hand lifted. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. Her fingertips brushed against my temple, tucking the loose strand back. But her touch lingered, feather-light, trailing for just a moment too long. I froze, caught between the urge to lean into her hand and the awareness of what that would mean. The world outside seemed to fall away. The ticking of the clock, the faint city sounds through the window, none of it mattered. All I could feel was the warmth of her fingers against my skin, the faint tremor in her touch, and the way her breath slowed as she drew closer. Our eyes locked, and suddenly it wasn't just about a strand of hair. It was about everything unspoken between us, the hours of glances exchanged across fences, the chance meetings that lingered too long, the loneliness she'd admitted to, the longing I had been too careful to name. I wanted to close the gap, to let the gravity pull us the rest of the way. But the weight of reality pressed down just as strongly. She was married. This was dangerous, fragile, a line we both knew should not be crossed. The silence grew taut, stretched like a thread ready to snap. Her hand hovered near my cheek, trembling slightly as though torn between retreat and surrender. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same war raging in my own chest. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath and let her hand fall, resting it in her lap. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental, a choice made in the space of a heartbeat. Still, the air remained charged, the ghost of her touch lingering on my skin like a secret. And though nothing had happened, everything had changed. The silence after her hand dropped was almost unbearable. My skin still burned with the ghost of her touch, and yet the absence of it left me colder than before. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on her lap, fingers intertwined tightly as if she were holding herself back from something. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the weight of the moment. But words felt clumsy, dangerous even. So I sat there too, caught in the gravity of everything we weren't saying. Then, with a small exhale, she shifted. Slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether I would pull away, she leaned toward me. Her head found my shoulder, resting lightly against it. The movement was subtle, but it carried the weight of trust, of surrender. For a moment, I didn't move. I just let myself feel it, the warmth of her cheek against the fabric of my shirt, the soft brush of her hair against my jawline. Her perfume rose faintly again, mingling with the simple scent of tea still lingering in the air. I let my arm move almost instinctively, sliding around her shoulders. The moment my hand rested there, she released a quiet sigh, not of frustration, but of relief, as though something inside her had finally loosened. We sat like that, in the hush of the dimming evening, bodies angled toward one another, hearts beating in rhythms that felt almost synchronized. I could feel the steady rise and fall of her breath, the gentle weight of her leaning into me. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't reckless, but it was intimate in a way that no words could capture. She spoke softly, her voice muffled against me. I don't even remember the last time someone held me like this. The confession cut through me, tender and painful all at once. I tightened my arm just slightly, not in possession, but in reassurance. You deserve to be held. To feel safe. She didn't respond right away, but I felt her hand shift, resting lightly on my forearm. Her touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a warmth through me that settled deeper than desire. Minutes passed like that, timeless, as though the world outside had stopped moving. It wasn't passion that filled the room now, it was something quieter, more dangerous, belonging. And in that fragile stillness, I realized the line between right and wrong had blurred into something achingly human. The light outside had shifted into evening by the time she stirred. For what felt like an eternity, we had sat there in silence, my arm around her, her head resting against me. The quiet had been enough, but reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you try to hold it at bay. She lifted her head slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair back into place. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment, searching, as though weighing whether to stay just a little longer or to do what she knew she must. "I should go," she said finally, her voice hushed, almost apologetic. The words landed heavy, though not unexpected. She smoothed her skirt, straightened her blouse, and tried to compose herself, but I could see the hesitation in every movement. She wasn't ready to leave, not really. But the world outside demanded it. I rose with her, walking her to the door. The room suddenly felt emptier, as though even before she stepped out, her absence had begun to echo. She slipped on her shoes with deliberate slowness, buying seconds in a place where time had already betrayed us. At the door, she turned. Her hand found mine, warm, deliberate, lingering. Her fingers wrapped around my own in a way that spoke louder than any words could. Gratitude, longing, and a quiet promise all pulsed in that simple contact. "Thank you," she whispered. I wanted to ask, for what? For the tea. For listening. For giving her a moment of escape. But the way she looked at me told me it was more than that. She was thanking me for seeing her, for holding space where she could finally breathe. I squeezed her hand in return, reluctant to let go. For a second, it felt like neither of us would. Her thumb brushed lightly across my knuckles, and the softness of the gesture carried more intimacy than any embrace could. Finally, she pulled away, though slowly, as though reluctant to break the fragile thread that connected us. She stepped into the hallway, the faint sound of her heels against the floor pulling her farther from me with each step. I stood there in the doorway, watching as her figure retreated down the corridor. Even when she disappeared from sight, the trace of her presence clung to the air, the warmth of her touch still lingering in my hand, the quiet scent of jasmine still folded into my shirt. The door closed gently behind me, leaving me alone in the silence. But it wasn't emptiness I felt. It was a fullness that ached, the knowledge that for one evening, something had awakened between us, something that would not be easily forgotten. And though she had left, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a secret I would carry, one heartbeat at a time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps me bring more slow-burn age gap romances to life. And I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below.